Hello, my name is Lisa Ross, though you may know me better as Paper Daisy Creations, and today I'm going to be showing you how to work a provisional cast-on. Now, a provisional cast-on may sound really intimidating, but the version we are going to do is actually nothing more than casting on in waste yarn and then continuing on from there. The tricky part comes when we go back to pick up those stitches, but once you see this method, I'm confident that you are going to learn this new skill with ease and be able to add that to your knitter's toolbox. A provisional cast-on is created so that we can put some live stitches back on our needles. So right here, I have this dark blue waste yarn. That is my provisional cast-on. And these light blue stitches are my working yarn, and I want to use those live stitches later. In this mystery cowl that I've designed, those stitches are going to play an important part later on, and we want to have live stitches there. And so this provisional cast-on is going to allow me to do that. So to work this cast-on, you will need some waste yarn. I'm using this dark blue yarn. You'll need your gauge needles, so the needles you're using for the project. And I also have some removable stitch markers, and these are going to help out for later on. I want to place them, and those are going to indicate what stitches I'm going to need later on in this process. All right, so I have my waste yarn and I'm going to work a long tail cast on. So when I was taught to work a long tail cast on, I was taught to begin with a slip knot. You actually don't need to do that. And I actually recommend that you do not use a slip knot anytime you do a long tail cast on, because it creates a little knot right there in your work and you don't need it. So what I'm going to do, I like to hold the yarns with my pinky finger. And then I put my thumb and forefinger into that middle opening and spread it apart. You can see this finger is keeping that yarn snug on the needle. And I'm just going to work a regular long tail cast on. And for this, I'm doing 12 stitches. But if you're using this for the mystery cowl or any other pattern, be sure you're working the correct number of stitches for the pattern. Okay, I'm going to go under this very front yarn. And it goes under that front yarn and into the hole by my thumb. And I scoop up this yarn that's between my thumb and forefinger and I pull it back through. And that is the second stitch on my long tail cast on. The first one was created just by having that yarn on there. So I'm going to do this 12 times. So I go under the front yarn and the needle comes up through the hole next to my thumb. I go behind, over and behind the yarn that's on top of my forefinger, and I pull that yarn back through the hole that I came into. And then my thumb can just snug that yarn right up, and that's my third stitch. So under the front yarn, scoop up the yarn by the forefinger by going over and behind, pull it back through the hole, drop that thumb and pull it tight. And I'm going to make 12 stitches like this. So I've got 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And that's it. That is my provisional cast on right there. That's it. That's my provisional cast on. So here's what I'm going to do next. I'm going to snip my yarns and I am going to create a slip knot right here. And the reason I'm going to do that is just so that this doesn't get loose. I want to keep those stitches until I'm ready to remove my provisional cast on. And so I'm going to create a slip knot right there. And I'll show you that one more time. I just loop the yarns over and then pull through. And what that does is it creates just that little slip knot It's just a super basic slip knot, and it's going to keep these stitches from unraveling. And if at any point I'm working and this comes out, I can just make that slip knot again, just to hold those stitches in place. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to place a green marker on the very first stitch, and I'm going to place a purple marker on the very last stitch. Now there's a few things that you need to note with this. So the first is, my first stitch is closest to the tip of the needle. While I was holding it this way for the cast on, I did turn it. And then the other thing is that these markers need to stay in the front of the stitches as you work the first row. And the reason why is because if this gets flipped to the back, it's going to be marking the back leg of that stitch instead of the front leg. Now I have my working yarn and I'm ready to begin working the pattern. So this pattern begins with 2 stockinette rows. So I will be knitting across the front and purling across the back. And that little set of stockinette rows is going to make it much easier to pick up these stitches when I come back to them. So let me show you how I do this. I go into the first stitch and I'm going to knit it. And you'll notice that I'm holding the tail of the yarn with the working yarn. And that is my very best trick for weaving in ends as I go. So I'm going to hold those two together for the first few stitches, and I'm just going to knit across. So I'm holding those two yarns together, and you'll see that it creates this this doubled stitch right here. I just have to remember that when I come back that is worked as a single stitch and not as a double stitch. And if this step is too complicated, don't do it. You don't need to. I'm just going to work the first 4 stitches as those doubled stitches. I'll remember that when I come back to pick those up, those are only single stitches. I knit across, and remember that that purple marker that I have, that removable marker, has to be towards the front of my work when I get to it. I do not want it to flip to the back. So I've worked that stitch. You can see my dark blue provisional cast on, and I'm ready to work the back. All I'm going to do is purl across, and you'll notice after you finish this row that last stitch of the first row, it kind of twists, and that's why I find it really helpful to have my removable marker there. All right, I'm up to this doubled stitch. That's worked as a single stitch, and this end is now securely woven in. Okay, and now I can begin working the pattern. Okay, I've worked a few rows in garter stitch. Now obviously this is not the same as the pattern that has been linked, but I used fingering weight yarn and much smaller needles, and it is much harder to see this provisional cast on and this next step in the actual version of the pattern. So I've created this larger version so that you can see it much easier. I'm ready to pick up these stitches. What I'm going to do is choose a needle that is smaller than the needle I was using, and I'm going to be picking up the right leg of each stockinette stitch that goes into the dark blue stitches. So you'll see, if you look closely, each dark blue stitch has 2 legs coming out of it. And we want the right leg. So for every stitch, we want the right leg of that stitch. Now here you can see where I started. Remember, I put a green marker there. That keeps that, that shows you exactly where you're going to begin. So I'm beginning with this right stitch right here, the right leg of the first stitch. And I'm going to pick up the right leg, going over the left leg for each of these stitches. Now remember, those first few stitches I doubled, and if you did the same, you'll need to pick up both legs just to keep those the same. but I'm picking up that right leg of each stitch all the way across. Now, it is much easier to see on this larger yarn, it will be a little bit trickier with fingering weight yarn, and especially if you have a darker yarn. Okay, now here is my last stitch, and you can see right here it's sort of twisted, and that's because when I turned it, the stitch twists when I work it a second time, but I still need this right leg that's sticking into that first purple stitch, or the first dark blue stitch with the purple marker. And I'm going to count all my stitches just to make sure I have the correct number. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. That is correct. I've got all 12 stitches securely put on my needle, and now I'm ready to remove the markers and remove my provisional cast on. And here's how I do that. I'm going to take out the slip knot. And now all I'm going to do is unpick this yarn, and I'm just using the needle, this small needle that was attached, but you could use whichever needle you like. And what I like to do is just pick one side and pick out all the stitches from that side. I think this side's usually a little easier. Yeah. And at any point, you can trim this waste yarn down. You can just snip it off. You don't have to be pulling these long lengths through there. It just makes more scraps if you do that. And I'll show you what I mean. So if it gets a little tight to pull all that through, or if it keeps getting caught, just snip it down, and then you can keep pulling that out. It's much quicker. And you'll see once I've pulled out one whole side, this side comes out much easier. Oh, it looks like, okay, it did not go much easier. So the yarn is stuck right here. I have split the yarn with my, I split that waste yarn with my needle. So I'm just going to trim it off. And then I can just pull that out. There we go. All right, and I'm down to my last stitch. I pull it through. I now have 12 stitches ready to use, all on my needle and with very minimal effort. I'd like to thank you all for joining me on learning how to work a provisional cast-on. You can find this mystery cowl pattern and all of my patterns on Ravelry and PaperDaisyCreations.com. And as always, I wish you very happy knitting.